but certainly in the United States, it's so easily capturable. If we're afraid of Donald Trump, and I am, why would you have an institution that Donald Trump could take over?
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair, we're trying to talk about the technology companies, not the government. And the question is, do for their 1%, it may only be 1%, not 45%, but they are still extremely powerful institutions that arguably have social costs.
I'm an economic historian as well, and this has happened over and over again. In the 1890s, the fear of the sugar trust and the meat barons and coal barons and so on and so forth was great. And what we did in the United States, and you did it in Britain to some extent too, was we set up government agencies to regulate these big things, and then the government agencies were taken over by the very companies they were intended to regulate. And it happened with remarkable speed. So if we had the philosopher kings, then the countervailing power thing would make sense, but I think we're fallen humans. I'm an Anglican.
Chianwara, can you defend government?
I will defend government. I will absolutely defend government, because it is really quite hypocritical to say that Google shouldn't be paying taxes because government is the biggest thing around. Google needs government. All companies need government. They need laws that people in this room feel trust enough to keep those laws. So there is a need for government. There's a need for educated people educated well enough to be able to go online and then buy all the Amazon products. So actually there is a codependency with big companies, and they are not recognizing that as part of that they need to pay the taxes, whether there are philosopher kings or not.
Anatol Kaletsky.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'd just elaborate that. I think there are two aspects of government, Deirdre, that you're missing. The very existence and survival, and certainly the profitability of companies like Apple depends totally on government.
I agree with
because
that.
If it were not for government protection of so-called intellectual property, the iPhone would be sold for $70 and not $700.
I didn't say zero government.
No, but therefore, for their very survival, these companies need government, and therefore it seems logical that they should be forced to contribute to the cost of government. That's number one. Government is also necessary, as has been shown through history, to break up monopolies. One of the ways that the American economy particularly has progressed over the last century, I think, has been by the breakup of monopolies, including the Tobacco Trust, the Standard Oil Trust. Certainly one of the ways that the current generation of technology companies got going was because of the breakup of AT&T and IBM as a result of government antitrust policy. So there's that issue. But the other issue is the one that I was emphasizing earlier, is that there is a fundamental difference between the power of government and the power of any private entities, because at least in principle, the government is there to represent all of us as citizens rather than to represent. Now, if it fails to do so, and I agree it often does, that is our problem and our responsibility. But we can't simply say, let's forget about government and let us be in the power of entities whose sole purpose is to make money.
No, well, I think there's some consensus from what I can hear that the government is needed and that it needs to be paid for, and that probably these companies should pay their fair share of tax to do that.
I agree.
So what about Margaret Heffernan, the point that these companies, are they that threatening as monopolies when they come and go so quickly? I mean, they emerge incredibly fast and presumably can decline, and some of them have declined incredibly fast. So maybe we're worrying too much.
Yeah, I wouldn't be so sure that Google's just going to kind of disappear in the next couple of years. I think, it's really important to understand that the prevailing wisdom within Silicon Valley at the moment is that the business model for the Internet of Things is insurance. Okay, so as long as I can keep track of your driverless car and I can keep track of your movements from your phone, and let's be clear, you can already do that on certain British motorways, know exactly where people are, because that's how you modulate the traffic. So as long as you have a monopoly on this huge amount of data, then you have the ability to manage the insurance market, to decide who gets insurance, who doesn't. And I think to Anatol's point, the issue around these companies is their legitimacy, which is who are they there for? And Google, for all that it's really cute and run by two hunky guys, is not there necessarily for me or for the citizens of the company in which it operates. It is there for its shareholders, and that is a subset of the citizenry. So what I find disturbing when I go to Silicon Valley, which I do a lot, is the arrogance that says we are so smart and we are so superior to government that we need not pay any attention to it. Or as one VC said to me the other day, there's nothing wrong with education that online teaching won't deal with. There is nothing wrong with healthcare that getting rid of doctors won't solve. There's nothing wrong with the legal system that getting rid of lawyers won't solve. This is an attitude which is coming to dominate our world, but we haven't sanctioned it, we haven't voted for it, and it will become increasingly difficult for us not to get sucked into the economic networks that will make it possible.
Chianwara.
Before I came into Parliament, I did work as an engineer, not only in the private sector. I worked for 6 years for Ofcom, the regulator, the competition regulator. And whilst I was there, I would say if Facebook and Google and others, their attitude was quite, if we ignore government long enough, it will go away. But it's up to government, which also means it's up to you, to make sure that we have in place the systems which ensure that we have competition, that we have accountability, and that these companies, these giants, are regulated in the interests of our values. Yes, in the interest of our values, because we are the country, we are the world.
We are the country, you say, and yet you have 2 or 3 candidates who you can vote for.
I just say the diversity of Silicon Valley, of these tech giants, they are acting, representing a small demographic, which is basically white men. So that's who designs these networks.
Yeah, I know who designs the network. But, why do we have cell phones? We have them because you want them. You vote with your pounds and your dollars. It's for the stockholders. There's profit being earned, which is a tiny percentage of the gross of these companies. But the main actors in this are consumers. And so it's very strange. Again, my friends on the left, and it's kind of 3-1 here.
It is, yeah.
They say, voting is much better than market voting in the polls. Well, sometimes it is for certain issues like desegregation and human rights and so on. I'm all for it. But not for phones or for toilet paper or for bread. We need the market, and it's you all who vote in the market.
I tell you what, we need to take a break now, so we will re-engage just after that. We've just got to take a break. Just to remind you, if you want to write to us, please do that. newshour.extra@bbc.co.uk. Tweet at @BBCNHExtra. There is the podcast. It's one edition, as I say, every week. Just put BBC NewsHour Extra into your search engine, and it will lead you there. And we are discussing the internet giants, the technology giants, and whether they need to be tamed in any way. And in the second half of the programme, we'll be particularly looking at how governments might go about trying to control these companies with greater effect. And our panel, just to remind you, is Chianwara, who's Opposition Minister for Culture and the Digital Economy. We've got Professor Deirdre McCloskey from the University of Illinois, Anatol Kaletsky, an economist here in the UK, and the entrepreneur Margaret Heffernan. So, we were basically talking about the democratic accountability of these companies and whether we need to think about accountability of corporations in the same way as we think about accountability of governments. So why don't we throw that open to you, Margaret Heffernan, and do you think that is realistic? Do you think it's appropriate? Is that something we should be trying to do?
Well, so I think, corporations typically take a quite narrow view of accountability. There are, of course, exceptions to that, but generally speaking, although it isn't legally the case, most corporations and their heads think that they are accountable to shareholders and that they have a requirement to maximize value for those shareholders. There are other views in that, which are that companies can't function well if they don't exist within healthy, vibrant, well-educated, safe societies. And therefore, as much as many corporations prefer to ignore this, there is a social responsibility that every company operating has to deal with, which is it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists on the back of education systems and road systems and policing systems and so on. And it itself cannot flourish without recognizing that dependency and in some respect contributing to it, whether it's by taxes or other things. But companies don't exist in a bubble. The market isn't an even playing field. We know that markets routinely fail, and one of the jobs of government is to deal with that market failure.
But Angela Koletsky, I guess what I'm trying to ask is shareholder democracy, does it work? Or do you need more?
I think so far, most, perhaps not all, but most of these technology companies have actually been exemplary in terms of their social responsibility, in terms of their willingness to reinvest a very substantial part of their profits in research and activities which are don't directly contribute to their bottom lines, but which potentially, at least in their view, and actually in my view, could enhance human welfare in the long term. The entrepreneurs who set these companies up, in almost all cases, have at least announced that they're going to give away most, if not all, of the enormous wealth that they've accumulated during their lifetimes, for socially desirable and, on the whole, politically progressive causes which I support. So in many ways, as companies go, they have been exemplary. And interestingly enough, because most of them have either been private companies for much of their existence, or even as public companies have so-called golden shareholdings and so on, which actually give no power at all to the so-called shareholder democracy of pension funds, investors, which I think is utterly bogus. So far, I think it's great. What worries me is what happens in the future, not necessarily in the next few years, in the next decades and centuries, when artificial intelligence develops, as I think it inevitably will, to the point where it can take over more and more human decision-making. And that is an issue that, at the very least, I think these same entrepreneurs ought to be seriously engaged in. They should be funding. They should be looking at the ethics of it, rather than just saying, there isn't an ethical problem, we're just in favor of progress.
Well, if it gets to that point...
Yeah, and we're the good guys, yeah.
If it gets to that point, then accountability will become the biggest issue.
Absolutely.
And accountable to whom? Accountable to whom? I think this is the big issue. They're taking data, they use our data, that we very often are very unaware of what they're doing with our data. They are not accountable to us, and they appear not to be accountable to governments. And I have to say, I think that what she has said is, music to my ears. But most people I have met in government are so profoundly ignorant of technology. They are so unaware of how it operates, and they are so easily seduced by its charm and glitziness that it really worries me that these very, very large organizations will take their products and their technology and our blind submission to them and run where they want, which may have nothing to do with our long-term interests.
So, Chianwara, I think there's probably been more effort in Europe than the States, I don't know if that's quite right, to regulate some of these companies and to break up some of their monopolistic practices. Is that something that you think should happen more in the UK context, or not?
There are two main areas that we need. We need digital rights. We have data protection, but that doesn't address the fact that you have a 32-page terms and conditions which give away what digital rights are not defined anywhere. And Facebook says you own your own data, but that has absolutely no meaning. And and it's not something that you can pass on as an asset. There are so many issues. It is the complexity of it. There are so many issues around this, around consumer rights. And do you own the music on your player, on your tablet? What does that mean? And what right do you have? Say Uber knows when your phone battery is running out, and it can use that information to charge you more because it knows you're willing to pay more. It says it doesn't do that now, but there's no transparency on that algorithm, and you have no right to find out what that algorithm is. So give digital rights, and identify them, debate what they are, identify digital rights, establish them, and also ensure transparency. And I think the two will do the job.
Professor McCloskey.
I am astonished at the enthusiasm for the philosopher kings, and queens. There's a daily vote in markets. I won't say the market because that frightens people, but in markets for water. Look, we have water for sale. Once water, you would drink it out of a fountain and you'd get beriberi or polio or something. Now you have it in these nice little bottles. So it's a vote, a daily vote. By the way, just incidentally, I personally am against intellectual property, which I think is a fraud and a danger. You only have to know that patents and copyrights were invented in the 15th century by the Venetians, those great states.